At some point, you might have seen buildings with signs like this with the word imeni. Imeni is the genitive form of imya, name. It's how we can express something is named for someone. But if the basic nominative form is imya, how do we get the genitive imeni? Where does this yen come from? And when you look at the other cases, you see that that syllable is there in most of the other forms. So maybe we should be asking, why isn't it there in the nominative and accusative singular? And why would a neuter noun end in ya for these two forms? We'll look at that in a moment. If you're interested in why this happens, stay with me for the next 2 or 3 minutes. For now, I'll say that as a practical matter, this is just one of those irregular patterns that needs to be memorized. The good news is that there are only 10 words in Russian with this pattern. These two, imya and время, are the ones you'll use most often. Well, unless you're a dairy farmer. So this is worth your attention. If you are curious about why forms like imya and время have this pattern, we'll need to go back in the history of the language. A very long time ago, most forms had the yen syllable that we still see today, but the nominative and accusative singular form looked something like this, where that last letter was a nasal vowel. We can assume that even farther back, this form also had yin, but that with time, the n at the end of the word was lost, and what remained was a nasal vowel. This might remind you of French words like mon, where we don't pronounce that final n, but there is still a nasal quality in the vowel. Then, as time went on, this nasal vowel developed into the ya that we see today in imya. In these other forms, though, the n was not lost because it was at the beginning of a syllable. Again, this might remind us of the French mon ami, where we do pronounce the n when it's at the beginning of a syllable. Mon ami, mon ami. And this sets up the contrast between imya and all the other forms, the contrast that persists in the language even today. But what about the question of gender? Well, now we know that that final ya in imya developed from a different syllable, not an originally feminine ending, like we see in nouns like земля. And so that explains why these 10 nouns are neuter, not feminine. Notice how all of these neuter nouns end in ya in the nominative, which can make them easier to recognize. You don't need to remember all these historical details, but you will want to memorize these forms since they will come up pretty often. For example, сколько времени? У нас времени нет. Библиотека имени Ленина. And when you come to the genitive plural, notice that because that last syllable is stressed, the ye has become yo in these forms. That's because of another historical sound change that we can talk about in another video. For example, этих имен. 100 лучших фильмов всех времен. Of course, you may not see the yo spelled with dots. And one last note, variation in a language is normal, and sometimes there's a tendency to even out or do away with irregular patterns like these. A.P. Vlasto, in his Linguistic History of Russia to the end of the 18th century, notes that one Russian dialect reformed imya to look like a normal neuter noun with forms like these. And in another dialect, the yen syllable was added to the nominative singular by analogy to the other forms. This approach seems to be what resulted in the standard Czech word for name, jméno. Nevertheless, for Russian, it's best for us to stick with the standard forms, even if they do look pretty irregular. In any case, it's a nice example of how exceptions are not there to make life difficult. Often, they're just the result of sound changes over time. Summing up, 10 Russian neuter nouns have an unusual pattern. The nominative and accusative singular end in ya, following an m. Most other forms have an additional syllable, yen, or in the genitive plural, usually yon. Two really important words with this pattern are imya and время.